introduce our moderator for the evening, who's also been around SNA for a long time. He's been a board member for a long time, and just general great community fella. His name is Tom Schmeling, right here behind me. He is a political science professor at Rick, and a wonderful person. So we picked him to moderate the evening. I'm sure he'll do a wonderful job. So without further ado, here he is, Mr. Tom Schmeling.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight, and I'd like to thank our candidates for joining us. I'll lay out the rules a little bit here. We have questions that have been submitted by the neighbors. You have all seen the emails flying around, and people have submitted questions, and members of the board submitted questions. We took them. I'm not going to attach names to any of the questions because some of them were directed at specific candidates, and we've tried to make them more generic and apply to everyone, although if you hear your question, you can raise your hand and announce that it was your question. Each candidate will get 90 seconds to respond to the question, and then 30 seconds to respond or rebut to what the other candidates have said. We're going to go for about 40 minutes. That's not a lot of questions with 3 candidates, and then we will take questions from the audience if you have specific questions for the candidates. Our candidates here with us this evening, and I'm not looking for their introductions, I'm looking for the little card that tells me which order that I'm supposed to go in, which I just lost. First of all, we have Brendan Doherty, who joined the Rhode Island Police Force in 1980, retiring as a major after 24 years. After 3 years at Roger Williams as Director of Public Safety, he rejoined the State Police as a colonel, stepping down in 2011. David Cicilline won a seat in the Rhode Island House of Representatives in 1994, and beginning in 2004, served 8 years as the mayor of Providence. In 2010, he was elected to Congress. David Vogel in the center attended Moses Brown School and earned his BA from Cornell and an MBA from URI and law degrees from Roger Williams in Villanova, and currently practices immigration law. Without further ado, I'll jump into the questions here, asking the candidates those questions in the reverse order that I just introduced them, and begin here. Since it was enacted, the House of Representatives has voted 31 times to repeal the... Oh, my mistake. Yes, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I forgot. 2-minute opening statements. My apologies. In the reverse order.
Oh, I have to go first. I wasn't expecting to have. I thought Colonel Doherty was going to make the first opening statement. But hello, my name is David Vogel, as he mentioned, and I'm running as an independent. Now, full disclosure, I grew up here in Rhode Island, which meant that by default I was a Democrat. I'm actually still a registered Democrat, but because of the quirky rules here in the state, we have the option of running as an unaffiliated, even if we're affiliated. Don't let that scare you. I don't agree with everything that the Democrats do. I obviously don't share the right-wing agenda, hence I'm an independent. Now, I get asked the following question an awful lot. Why are you running? I'm running because in a democratic process, and I think both of my opponents would agree, there is no set limit, there's no entitlement on elections, there's no set limit on how many people can be in a race, and there's no set agenda, quite frankly. If you are trying to do the people's business eventually, then there shouldn't be an actual defined number of people or parties who are allowed to do that limit. Now, having said that, the reason I'm in the race is because I, like an awful lot of people, have gotten incredibly frustrated with partisan politics at every level, state, local, federal, you name it. And I'm not a protester by nature. I've been a lawyer for 14 years. I'm not a litigator, so I don't go out and protest. But at this point in my life, I'm just about midlife, and since I'm not going to join Occupy or anything like that, but I'm not going to sit by and watch my government essentially fail and fail and fail this country. So I am in the race. Thank you.
And
good evening. Thank you to the Summit Neighborhood Association for hosting this, and thank you to both of my opponents for agreeing to be part of this. I'm really happy to be here. I'm running for re-election because I believe there is a tremendous amount of work to be done, and I believe that I can make a difference. That's why I ran for Congress in the first place. I believe very strongly that we need to do what the President said, and that is invest in rebuilding the middle class of our country, making investments in education, innovation, small business, infrastructure, all the things that are necessary to grow our economy. We need to honor the promises we've made to our seniors in Medicare and Social Security. And we need to honor the service to our veterans. And we're fighting against, on the Democratic side, a House Republican leadership that has a very different view of a very different kind of America that they're trying to build. And these are folks who have built an economic theory based on this notion of giving tax cuts to people at the very top and waiting for it to trickle down to the rest of us. And these are folks who are opposing the Buffett rule that will assure millionaires and billionaires pay their fair share, that are resisting efforts to rebuild American manufacturing, that are fighting to repeal historic health care reform, that have engaged in a real assault on women. And I've had the honor of representing this great state for the last 2 years and standing up and fighting for the things that I know are important to Rhode Islanders. And I'm here to ask for your vote so I can continue that work for 2 more years. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for having me here. I want to thank the Summit Neighborhood Association and commend them for all the good work that they do. I want to thank David Vogel and Congressman Cicilline for agreeing to this forum, and also Professor Schmeling. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm running for Congress because I believe that we need a stronger voice in Washington, and I believe that Congress is broken right now. This is the greatest country in the world, but Congress is broken. Democrats and Republicans couldn't agree that it's dark out right now. So we need leadership. Leadership's not about ranks and privileges and titles. Leadership's about taking responsibility for what happens on your watch. Leadership means sometimes facing the music even when you don't like the tune. So, you know, it reminds me of the old saying by Reverend Martin Luther King: the ultimate measure of a man or woman is not during times of comfort and convenience, but during times of conflict and controversy. And we are in conflict and controversy right now all over the world. So we need leaders, and strong leaders, to go to Washington to step up for America. We need to attack the $16 trillion debt. We have a $16 trillion debt, folks. We can't turn this over to our children and our grandchildren. This cannot be our legacy. But we need to come to reasonable solutions as to how we do that. And we need tax reform. We need regulatory reform. And we need a real robust energy policy. So we need to address the different problems that we have in this country, but none more important than Social Security and Medicare. And throughout this campaign, I've talked about how I want to go to Washington to strengthen Social Security and Medicare. And I've embraced the Simpson-Bowles plan, which does just that. So folks, I'm running for Congress because I want to help effectuate change in Washington. Thank you very much for having me here.
So before I begin with the questions, I'll point to Anthony Arrigo here in the front row, who has some time cards with him. So when your 90 seconds to answer the question is up, he'll be letting you know that. The first question to Congressman Cicilline. Since it was enacted, the House of Representatives have voted 31 times to repeal the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, sometimes known as Obamacare. If elected to Congress, would you vote for or against the repeal of the act? And if you would vote for repeal, what specific legislation would you support to ensure that Americans will be able to afford health insurance?
Well, I've had the privilege on every time that this issue has come before the Congress to vote against repeal. I think this historic health care reform, or Obamacare, is good for Rhode Island, it's good for our country. It ensures that 30 million Americans who currently are not, don't have insurance coverage will have it. It closes the donut hole for seniors, which is very important to many, many seniors in Rhode Island all across this country, to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. It provides free preventative care for seniors, which is very important in terms of seniors' health. It provides young people with the ability to stay on their parents' plan until they're 26. It ends lifetime caps on insurance policies and allows children with pre-existing conditions to have insurance, and ends discrimination against them. It will, over time, drive down healthcare costs. It's very important that we protect healthcare reform, make sure it's implemented in a way that serves Rhode Island, but this notion of repealing it and starting this process all over again, and the fight that took place, I think is a mistake, and if I'm elected to Congress, I'll continue to fight to preserve historic healthcare reform.
Thank you. Colonel Doherty.
Thank you. I would vote to repeal it only with a new and better plan. I think that it needs to stand the test of time, just like Social Security and Medicare did. We know that, well, we all want every American to have health care. And there are good ideas in the Affordable Health Care Act. There certainly are. And I've said this several times. Democrats come up with good ideas and Republicans come up with good ideas. I think we need a bipartisan effort to, in Washington, if we can come up with a better plan, because we didn't address efficiency, we didn't address tort reform, but there are some good things. We need to address evidence-based standards of care in tort reform. But there are good parts of the Affordable Health Care Act. Certainly the closing the donut hole and pre-existing conditions, and the 26-year-olds being able to be insured on their parents' plan. Because I have a daughter who just graduated from college, and I understand that. A lot of these kids that just graduated from school are not able to find jobs. And right here in Rhode Island, that's important, because we have the second highest unemployment rate in the country. So I want to take the good pieces from the Affordable Health Care Act and work together in a bipartisan solution to come up with a better plan.
Thank you. I want to follow up just because the second part of the question is there specific legislation that you would support?
In the Affordable Health Care Act?
If the act is repealed.
Well, I just talked about the 26-year-old, the donut hole, the pre-existing conditions. We need to look at efficiencies, and it's important. With the employer mandate right now, the employer mandate is a job impediment. It's going to kill businesses. So I think that we need to work together. And I believe that if President Obama is reelected, I believe that he will actually work toward improving that, because it's not a utopian bill right now.
Thank you. Mr. Vogel.
I agree with the congressman. I would definitely fight against its repeal, but I also wanted, Congressman Cicilline already outlined, as well as Colonel Doherty, several of the provisions, so I'm not going to rehash them here. But I wanted to make a couple of points about it. One of the reasons that it's an absolutely, I think, essential piece of legislation and essential for this country, and this is something that a lot of people kind of gloss over, it actually encourages competition. A lot of people don't realize that the healthcare exchanges that would be set up, especially including here in Rhode Island, actually give to the industry what they continually squawk about that they want, which is competition. But if you look at their actual actions, they work against competition at tooth and nail at every step of the way. And what the Affordable Care Act does is not only puts another 35 million people, roughly speaking, on affordable insurance, but it actually brings competition to a marketplace that heretofore has not had much competition. Competition does lead to lowering prices eventually. It's a good deal for the United States.
Thank you.
Did you say we were going to have rebuttals?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I want to disagree respectfully with Mr. Doherty's claim that it doesn't address efficiencies. In fact, part of the, one of the key parts of the historic healthcare reform is that it includes real investments in eliminating fraud, waste, and abuse, with increased penalties, better coordination, strengthening the standards. That's really a very important part of this. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office said that over the decade it will save, I think, $109 billion, reduce the deficit. The other piece of it that's very important is there's a very serious investment in wellness and prevention, and in reducing healthcare costs, really bending the cost curve by investing in new technologies, electronic medical records, and keeping people healthier. Women and Infants Hospital just got a grant as part of the healthcare reform that is allowing them to develop a new delivery system for dealing with prematurely born babies and preventing rehospitalizations, with the goal of reducing costs and improving health outcomes. Those are the kinds of innovations that this will bring.
Thank you very much. 30 seconds for rebuttal. Colonel Doherty.
Sure. I talked about efficiencies, and I'm talking about tort reform as well. And even Peter Orszag, who worked for President Clinton, embraced tort reform, and that's not even addressed in the Affordable Health Care Act. And when the Congressman mentioned the waste and fraud, we need to look at the waste and fraud in government. We had $48 billion in waste and fraud in Medicare in 2010, $48 billion, and we haven't done a good job combating that. So that's something that I want to look at when I get to Washington, but the Affordable Health Care Act doesn't put a lot of work, a lot of strength in that, Congressman.
Thank you. Mr. Bowman. Our second question, and we'll begin with Colonel Doherty. A recent poll gives a figure that the public approval of Congress right now is at a historic low of about 10%. I wonder if you could speak to why you think that is the case and what could be done about it, and if elected to Congress, what you in particular would do about it.
Well, I think that's something that has that Americans are concerned about, because, like I said in my opening, that Republicans and Democrats can't agree on much. They couldn't agree that it's dark out right now, and it's unfortunate because at a time when America needs Congress the most, Congress is broken right now. And I don't blame the Democrats or Republicans. It's just an atmosphere of disagreement right now. We just need we need strong people leaders to sit at the table, to be able to reach across the table, to be able to find common ground solutions to problems, because politics is just a reconciliation of competing interests at times. So when we have our differences, we should be able to work together, and that's what I've done throughout my career.
Thank you. Mr. Vogel.
Your question is exactly why I'm running. Congress, whether you're Republican or Democrat, is totally out of touch with the United States people. There is no question. I've done the research on this. I've looked at the lobbying dollars that have been flowing into the Congress for the last 20 years or so. I didn't do any research further than that. There was no point. But the fact is that the Congress, it really doesn't matter which side of the aisle you sit on, is in the pockets of corporations. It is out of touch with the United States. It is more in line with K Street than it is with Main Street. And I'm running as an independent. As I told you before, I grew up as a liberal, but I'm fed up with the disconnect that we have in Washington, really at every level. But there's no reason in the world that, as Colonel Doherty says, we can't work together, but we can't work together as long as K Street is ruling Washington.
Thank you.
I think there's no question Congress is broken, and I think there's a couple of reasons. One is, this is a system which is rigged against the middle class. You look at the power of big oil, the power of big banks, the kind of influence they exercise. I think what we have to do in a very serious way is address the way that we run elections in this country, the way we finance elections. We need to pass the Disclose Act. We need to reverse, by a constitutional amendment, Citizens United, and we need to pass a Citizen Finance the Fair Elections Act to really drive as much big money out of our campaigns as we can. I think campaign finance reform is a really important part of this. But we also have folks who have been elected to Congress who believe that compromise is a bad word. People who came to Washington and said, if I don't get it all the way I want, they're called the Tea Party. The Republicans are being led by the Tea Party in their caucus. They've hijacked the Republican caucus. And if they don't get everything they want, the answer is no. And these are folks who say, I'm not going to compromise, I'm going to stick to my principles. They've equated compromise with being unprincipled. And this is a legislative process. You never get everything you want. You make progress toward your goal. It's hard to imagine how some of these folks navigate through a marriage or a work relationship or a friendship, because I don't know anyone who ever gets everything they want in life. But I think part of that is a commitment also to defeat the president and make sure he's a one-term president. They've said that out loud, and so they've obstructed progress on nearly every issue. So I think it's about people understanding that we need to send people to Washington who are willing to work together and also who are willing to honor our values and fight for the middle class and fight for the things that are necessary to get Rhode Island and our country back on the right track.
Thank you. I guess there's 30 seconds for anybody who wants to add to, or Colonel.
What am I going to rebut?
The next question then will begin with Mr. Vogel. The national debt has reached $16 trillion, or a little north of $50,000 for every person in the United States. What spending cuts do you support to address this problem? And this is very important, could you please name things that you would ask Rhode Islanders, cuts that would affect the state of Rhode Island, your district, that you would ask them to accept?
Yeah. One thing that people will learn about me is that I don't pander for votes. Yeah, I would cut the military budget. If that means getting rid of the bases in Newport, so be it. The military budget is simply too large by orders of magnitude. I would even allow for $300 billion, and I still think that's outsized. So that'd be about, I think the military budget for, what is it, $673 billion is the fiscal year 2013 budget. So let's call it $373 billion off of that. Department of Homeland Security is bloated at a budget of roughly $60 billion. The United States Customs and Immigration Service is totally underfunded, so you can shift funding into that. But just between defense cuts and Department of Homeland Security, easily $400 billion there. You could easily shift funding. I like allocation, proper allocation. The United States government clearly does not understand how to budget even as well as a 5-year-old. So those are two specifics, and yeah, if it means that Newport takes a hit, oh well.
I think we need to look at cutting fraud and waste first, and we need to look at the silos of government that aren't communicating and working together. I've already talked about the $48 billion in Medicare fraud. There's fraud in so many waste and fraud in so many different areas of government. But when you talk about the contractors, the military, I wouldn't cut the military budget, but I would look at the estimated $34 billion in contractor fraud. That's where we're losing money overseas. And by the way, I think it's time we take our troops home. But we need to look at the contractor fraud in Afghanistan. We also need to look at reforms of farm subsidies. I mentioned the Simpson-Bowles Commission. And that talks about dropping the corporate tax rate. It talks about dropping the individual tax rate. But it also talks about cutting tax expenditures and cutting loopholes for the very wealthy. And Congressman Cicilline mentions that often. I'm a firm believer in cutting some of those substances, tax expenditures, and stop paying people to farm and paying people not to farm.
Since I've been in Congress, actually, I voted to cut over $1 trillion, and that first tranche of $900 billion covered lots of programs that I care about, and I think we all care about. And that was a very substantial cut. In fact, we've already cut, I think, about 50 or 60% of what Simpson-Bowles has recommended in terms of cuts. The challenge, and there's lots more we should be doing. We've been fighting on the Democratic side to end subsidies for big oil that amount to $40 billion over the decade, to end subsidies to large agricultural corporations, to cut, there's more than $1 trillion in tax expenditures, which is government spending for lots of different industries and lots of different businesses, and we ought to be looking at that in a very, very serious way. But the other challenge is we've got to look at revenues, and everyone has said this has to be done in a balanced way. The problem has been that 98% or 97% of the Republican members in the House have taken a pledge to a lobbyist, Grover Norquist, refusing to close a tax loophole, to change a rate, to end a subsidy, and so they've committed to not being part of the solution. You can't solve this problem unless you do it in a balanced way. That means cutting spending and generating revenue. Every economist that I know of says you have to do both. And when you talk about gridlock, when you have a vast majority of people on the other side who are saying, we won't agree to 1 red cent coming in new revenue, you can't solve the problem.
Thank you. I think, well, I'll give you the 30 seconds too, if you want to respond to what.
Well, first of all, I just want to mention that in Simpson-Bowles, it recommends a $4 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years. But in the congressman's progressive budget that we talked about, we've spoken about a couple of times now, it's so far to the left that it cuts the fleet of the Navy and it raises taxes on businesses. And 70% of the manufacturing companies in the United States of America are taxed on an individual basis. So it would tax the small businesses. We have 93,000 small businesses here around Rhode Island. They can't be taxed anymore.
I haven't taken the 30 seconds yet, so I get the 2 minutes now. Just in response to that, I just find it ironic that the Colonel does not like raising taxes on business, and yet he supports Simpson-Bowles. Simpson-Bowles clearly defines that it has a $100 billion tax increase from all of you.
Can I respond? Mr. Doherty made reference to the progressive budget. I want to just remind folks that progressive budget strengthens Social Security, eliminates the deficit in 11 years, restores America's competitiveness by investing in clean energy, job training, and education, ends the war in Afghanistan, ends subsidies for big oil, and in fact was described by President Clinton, who said, I quote, "It does two things far better than the anti-government budget passed by the House. It takes care of older Americans and others who need help, and much more than the House plan or Simpson Bowles, it invests a lot of our tax money to get America back in the future business." I think President Clinton's right.
Thank you. Can I respond to that? You did. But I'm going to give you another chance because I'm going to ask the next question I was going to ask that several of you touched on. President Obama has proposed to allow the Bush tax cuts to expire for the wealthiest in our country, but to keep them for the middle class, a proposal that Governor Romney has opposed. And I'd like to ask each of you where you stand on this issue with regard to the levels of taxation for the middle class and the most wealthy. And pardon?
When you say the wealthiest, is there a figure you're using?
Well, I think the original $250,000.
Well, I think that we need the Bush tax cuts to carry over to 2013 so that we can have comprehensive tax reform. And I talk about that a lot with Simpson Bowles, but we need comprehensive tax reform. But we don't need to, we don't want to tax our small businesses. Again, we have 93,000 small businesses around, and they grow jobs. We need to create an environment for our job growers, our businesses to do well. And if we are taxing, you know, some of those Bush tax cuts would kill some of those small businesses. If we're taxing over $250, we have many small businesses that are making over $250, and they're taxed on an individual basis. So, but I think we do need to look at all of those Bush tax cuts. There's some that are very important to American people, like the child credit and the home mortgage deduction. So there are important pieces there, but we just need to be very careful.
Mr. Doherty's position is consistent with the House Republican leadership and Mitt Romney, who last year, despite the fact that we put forth a bill that would preserve all the tax cuts for the middle class and allow them to expire in the top 2%, Mr. Doherty's party held middle class tax cuts hostage and refused to move that bill. And now Mr. Doherty takes the same position, that we should extend tax cuts to the top 2% millionaires and billionaires. I think President Obama is absolutely right. The $250,000 threshold would mean 98% of Americans and 97% of small businesses would see no tax increase. The vast majority, we would protect the child care tax credit, the education tax credit, the EITC tax credit. And look, we cannot afford to give another tax cut to the richest, to the top 2% in this country, and be serious about paying down the debt. Those should expire. They were intended to be temporary. They should be temporary. The job creators, with all due respect, are not the people at the very top. They're middle-class families who have money in their pockets, who have a job, who can buy the goods and services business produces. And we need to do everything we can to strengthen the middle class, to protect them from a tax increase. We should do it now before Congress adjourns for this year, and we should not hold them hostage so we can be guaranteed to give a tax break to millionaires and billionaires who don't need it.
I practiced tax law for about 3 years at the beginning of my legal career, so I have a small understanding of tax policy. The United States doesn't have a tax policy. What we have is a mishmash. Once again, K Street has invaded Washington over the years and has put together a system whereby people who can afford to buy the tax breaks have bought the tax breaks. What we're trying to deal with now is trying to patch it, basically what I call putting a Band-Aid on a geyser. And in terms of tax policy, we need people who are in touch with the real needs of the country from a tax policy standpoint, and to rework the system. Now, I'm not in favor of a flat tax. It's already been shown to be regressive. The CBO did that analysis, but the CBO also has done an analysis on what would happen if the Bush tax cuts actually expire. And the fact is that if the Bush tax cuts actually do expire, now I wouldn't be in favor of letting them all expire, because the congressman is absolutely right that there are a lot of them that need to expire and some that don't, or vice versa. But the fact is that if the majority of them, if the tax cuts expire at the upper end